All right, I think we'll get maybe one more minute. I see people piling in. Awesome. Welcome everybody. All right, I think we're ready. Let's get started. We've got enough folks going. Well, hey, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are coming and joining us from. Thanks for being here for today's webinar. I'm Matt Staney, VP of Community for the USA at Hire, where I focus on building a connected network of senior talent acquisition leaders through events, content, and insightful discussions like this one. For those who may not know, Hire is a global in-house talent acquisition community with over 12,500 members. Our mission is to elevate the TA profession through creating meaningful opportunities to connect and network with your world-class peers. We host regular events and dinners and breakfasts alongside producing these webinars and white papers, research that we do, big awards that we do towards the end of the year. So lots of ways to engage and be a part of the future of recruiting, right? And so if you're not a member yet, joining is completely free. You can just head over to www.hirehq.com to sign up, and then feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn as well. I'm just Matt Staney on LinkedIn. I'm the only one out there, easy to find. And so you can also scan a QR code that you should be seeing popping up on your screen right now. But before we get started, I just want to say a big thank you to Tofu, our sponsor for today's webinar, for making these conversations possible. Tofu protects your recruiting process from fake applicants. Their platform identifies and flags suspicious application, surfaces your best candidates, and continuously validates identity from applicant review all the way to final offer, right? So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining. I'm really pleased to welcome you to our webinar, Candidate Fraud in 2026, Getting Ahead of Risk. This has been coming up in so many of my conversations with TA leaders lately and around our roundtables. As hiring is becoming more remote, automated, and AI driven, candidate fraud is now a persistent operational risk for TA leaders. We've kind of gone from one of the lowest risk areas of a company to one of the highest when it comes to the company security as well as international security, right? And so today's conversation will explore what leaders are seeing in their funnels today, the trade-offs they are navigating, and how hiring processes are being shaped to manage risk without slowing teams down or damaging candidate experience. Okay, so we want this to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A. We will do our best to answer them throughout the session, and then we'll also have some time at the end for anything that we don't get to live, right? So yeah, let's start. I'll let our panel each briefly introduce yourselves, your background. Let's start with Carrie.
Yeah, I'm Kari Robinson. I
Sorry,
founded,
sorry.
that's okay. You're not the first person. So, I founded a recruiting operations consulting company called Pattern, where our team partners with talent orgs on just high impact recruiting initiatives, implementations, tech stack optimization, and in the late last year, a lot of candidate fraud. Prior to Pattern, I most recently led the RecOps team at Intercom.
Awesome.
And maybe you'll go to Nick.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Kari. Nick Servoy. I am manager of recruiting operations and innovation with Samsara. I have history as a recruiter. Was a individual contributor recruiter, recruiting manager for over a decade before I decided to apply that skill set a little bit differently and move behind the scenes to recruiting operations and technology.
Awesome. And Jason.
Hey everyone, I'm Jason. I'm one of the founders of Tofu. I'm based out of Toronto. My background is in kind of broader startups and like workforce labor. I actually was the GM at a company called ShiftSmart, which does like on-demand labor for shift jobs. So think like companies like Circle K and Pepsi use ShiftSmart to staff thousands of jobs a week. And I took a lot of what I learned over there and brought it over to what we're doing at Tofu, where we're focusing on building solutions for white collar side of the market, and specifically with fraud detection.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. Before we start diving in and getting kind of tactical on this discussion, I want to zoom out for a minute and look at our current state. So every TA leader I talk to has had a story lately. An interview that felt off, a sudden spike in applications, somebody working at the company for 8 months that turned out to be completely not the person they thought they were. And so, there's something that made them kind of maybe rethink their assumptions and their risk when it comes to candidate fraud. And so, for each of you, when did this stop feeling like an isolated issue and start feeling like a real business risk? Nick, at Samsara's scale, like what was the signal that made you realize traditional screening processes needed to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, at Samsara, it wasn't a single moment. It began as a trend in technical assessment pass rates. We saw a segment of candidates scoring incredibly high on asynchronous coding challenges, but then failing badly when asked to explain their approach, their logic during live follow-up. And so that started the thought process for us, and then it grew. The next and more obvious signal was anecdotal feedback from our recruiters and hiring teams with just how many fraudulent or suspicious profiles they felt they were encountering. That was as high as 30% of candidate volume in some roles. And finally, it actually took catching a candidate using a stand-in during a coding exercise to bring it all together. So a lot of things brought us to this place where, this is now something that we're hardening our process for at multiple points. But at our scale, you see, the top of funnel quality looking better than it ever has on paper, but pass-through rates and higher quality aren't moving correlatively. You know that the map no longer matches the territory, and that, traditional screening starts from the assumption that the person who submitted the application is the person doing the work. We had to evolve because that assumption was no longer safe.
Mm, wow. Kari, what about you? When you're building, these hiring systems at scale, either internally or with your clients, like how do you think about risk exposure and what's actually at stake for a business if, integrity isn't built in from the start?
Yeah. My big uh-oh moment was when, we kind of tried to follow the standard playbook around let's just start educating and enabling. And then within a few weeks, the game changed. And I think that's probably when I phoned a friend and reached out to Jason. And luckily, he validated a lot of that in terms of, we have to tackle this differently and approach this differently. When I think about risk exposure, my thought jumps to like risk mitigation. So to counteract that. And I think obviously there's no guarantees that you're going to catch everyone just yet, but I really started thinking about building hiring systems at scale. And that meant to me putting checkpoints starting at the beginning of the process. So even the low-hanging fruit is adjusting job descriptions to create deterrence for these type of applicants, then looking at, resume automation and review, trying to catch fraud in that way, but really like every single point in the recruiting process. That way you're mitigating risk along the way, such that when you get to offer and eventually hire, you've hopefully done your best in weeding out that potential fraudulent activity. And that's really all you can do, and just kind of trying to keep changing those checkpoints along the way.
Yeah, it sounds almost like you have to be always adapting, right? The
Yeah.
tactics are changing. Yeah, very very interesting. Thank you, Jason. You're building technology to fight this challenge, right? You're looking across data across millions of profiles. What's fundamentally changed in the last few years that got us here? Like, what's maybe the common patterns that you're seeing in how AI is being used by candidates for better and worse, which is adding to this
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting because I think if you talk to some recruiters, they'll actually tell you like this has been happening for years and years and years, like
Hmm.
even before 2020. So it's not just that like remote work sent this I mean, remote work sent it into like the stratosphere and kicked up volume. But identity theft, impersonation, like people not who they say they are applying to jobs like that isn't necessarily new. Just the scale at which it's exploded is because of a few shifts that
And,
happened post
and,
pandemic.
and the tools they can use too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's
Wow.
what makes a lot of it easier. So I kind of break it down into like three categories. You have like pre-interview, right? So that's like applicant fraud detection, applying to jobs at scale, like using AI to apply to jobs at scale, creating fake identities, spinning up aliases with AI tools. You can actually automate like a lot of account creation now with certain tools to make it look like your email actually has some like viable history. When you look into it, it's like how many accounts are associated. But now we're seeing obviously AI being used more and more in interviews. Like, for the group here, like that deepfake situation that I shared with you last week, which was strikingly real looking.
I never would have known that that was a deep fake ever.
Yeah. And so using AI to change what you look and sound like to cheat, Nick, like you mentioned, where person absolutely crushes their interview and then they can't actually explain or go into depth as to like why they did certain things. But then also AI is being used to essentially get past background checks. Um, and I mean, that's how these people are ultimately getting hired, right? Like security has always existed at the end of the funnel. Um, but when you have really good generative AI that can create very real looking documentation, it's not impossible for someone to get someone's address and create like a full fake ID. And then because that stuff is confirmed against databases and not actually determining whether like the identification is fake, those people just get past background checks and then they get cleared and they get hired. So, um, it's the trifecta, and that there needs to be something across every single step of the puzzle. But because the funnel is the biggest at the top, you get the most leverage from tackling it at the top.
Yeah. And so like with all these new tools, with AI coming in, you know, this isn't purely an AI story though, right? I mean, were our hiring systems already kind of vulnerable for this and this just exacerbated? Like, talk to me about that. And this is to anybody in the group that wants to chime in. Yeah.
I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. Our hiring systems are vulnerable. And the fact that recruiters have been saying that this has been happening for years, I think is proof positive of that. I've seen that at prior employers, even, as far back as 2020, we were starting to see this trend emerge. It was smaller, it was easier to spot, but it was there. And now that you have AI, kind of running on both ends of the process for folks, you need to create those intentional moments to review and scrutinize instead of just assuming like this automated check is going to catch everything.
Yeah.
And Tofu is part of like the solution that we've deployed from a getting more data perspective to put up against the candidate profile and make a decision whether a candidate is valid, real, with added confidence.
Hmm.
That's really been the transformative thing, is giving the recruiters more information and understanding that there are always going to be vulnerabilities in systems, but putting these checks and hardening systems where and when you can, I think, is the best approach you can take today.
Yeah, that's helpful because it because of compliance and some of these things, the company recruiters can't always like talk to each other about candidates or data that's coming in that might be affecting other companies. I remember, you're absolutely right that this has been going a long time because I remember back, it's probably over 10 years ago at this point, accidentally uncovering a major FBI investigation of a candidate in Canada that was, you know, faking resumes to align really well with jobs even back then. And then once they meet the recruiter, they would, and this is just someone who was just really disgruntled because they got denied a job at a large FANG company. And so they started applying to all these FANG companies, finding out who the recruiting leaders were, and then doxing them online and ruining their entire digital footprints, right? Which was huge issue. The investigation took like a decade. They finally arrested the guy, right? And so, but now, like, there's tools to make that even easier. So let's talk about like where this actually enters the funnel, right? Let's get specific. Like, where is fraud actually entering the hiring funnel right now, and where are teams catching it maybe too late, or maybe even not at all. Uh, Car, let's go with you. What does candidate noise look like in 2026? Is it just more volume, or has the type of application changed?
Yeah, I think it's everything. It's like our recruiters are so burdened right now, not only with dealing with the ebbs and flows of like actual inbound applications, but now when layering fraudulent candidates, it's unmanageable. And I feel like up until this point, we've always kind of used recruiters as our gatekeepers to protect the business from that noise, and they did a great job. But now it's almost outpacing the internal capacity. And so I think that's why it's so important to start putting those guardrails in place from the start. And to me, that has to be through automation. I think if we just solely relied on the recruiter to catch this top of funnel and protect the business from the noise, it's not enough. And I'm kind of defining noise as, anything taking time away from the business. And so if you had a fake candidate, fraudulent candidate go all the way through the process, the hours wasted, not only for the business, but even the recruiters. And so historically, I think we've thought of less of the recruiter's time as being that of value. And now we're realizing it's actually a resourcing issue and they can no longer have the capacity to spend time weeding out these things. And that's why we really, I think, have to lean towards automation and top of funnel.
Right, yeah, it's sort of that first line of defense, right?
Yeah.
And then it's train the recruiters on, if they break through that, like what are some Nick, do you treat every role the same when it comes to integrity checks, or are there like different thresholds depending on the function or level?
Yeah, we don't treat everything the same. Treating every role the same is the fastest way to break your candidate experience and lose ground on cost per hire. So our approach is more of a risk-based model. And so your high privilege technical roles, if a role has access to production code, sensitive customer information, core, infrastructure, the integrity tool's higher. And we introduce a few layers of detection and verification early in the process for those roles. For high volume, entry level, the risk's less about like corporate espionage and more about that bot-driven noise that Kari mentioned. The threshold here is more about pattern recognition, detecting AI-generated resumes, non-human application behavior. And the approach is to reduce the noise and run more sophisticated signals when hiring team conversations are on the horizon. So, after we screen them in recruiters and we want to validate again before we ask hiring teams to commit time to a process with a candidate. We run a more in-depth check. And then for leadership roles, the check here is less about can they do the job and more about, are they who they say they are across their professional history, leaning harder into verified reference networks. Due diligence is pretty thorough at this level and is a little bit more manual, less on automation, more on network checking. But we do treat all of these roles a little bit differently and triage them through our, kind of fraud identification, prevention, and protection layer a little bit differently based on
Uh,
the role type.
Awesome. No, thank you. And we're getting some good questions coming through chat, but I just want to remind attendees to please use the Q&A. The reason is that then I can see it and make sure that we're answering every one of them. But Alex in the chat did have a good one here that's related, Nick, to what you were talking about, and that's what kind of checks or systems can be leveraged at the top of the funnel, starting with the applicant stage. And they've Alex said that they've tried to use knockout questions, but still are seeing a rampant amount of spam and fake candidates.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be less than truthful on an application, you're probably not going to mind answering a knockout question in the way that is going to move you forward. So I don't think
Yeah.
knockout questions are a solve for that. There are some solutions that are starting to pop up, like at the ATS vendor level, where they have like a verified account, verified profile, additional verification that a candidate can go through, and that saves them from having to create a bajillion Workday logins or a million greenhouse logins for different instances as they're searching for jobs. But that can be spoofed and fooled too. And so I think you need to take an approach where you do put some of these things in place, knowing that you've got these regular checks, they're complementary, and you're creating a little bit of drag or resistance that the candidate has to go through. the fraudulent candidates are going to look for the path of least resistance, and they're going to approach that. So if you can add even a few hurdles, it does deter some of that traffic. It won't catch all of it, won't deter all of it, but to answer Alex's question, I mean, I think it's a combination of solutions that you deploy, using what fraud prevention features your ATS has, using some of these bolt-on solutions like Tofu that have worked really well for us, and being intentional about where you place them in the process. And it's a combination of all of those things, plus partnership with your security team and partnership with people operations down funnel for more comprehensive like monitoring mechanism.
Got it. And Kari, I'm seeing a theme in our chat here. People think this has really become a problem just within software engineering and tech roles. But it's possible this is happening in non-tech too, right? But do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think we shouldn't underestimate if right now maybe it's starting there, but I think of how quickly it's changing, this could be illuminated across the board. And so
Yeah.
I think if we didn't take the same approach across all roles, you can definitely prioritize which ones you feel like are more high risk. I think you will have a leaky bucket and you will eventually see that problem manifest in non-tech roles as well.
Yeah, I mean, because on these software engineering, people are saying they're getting, they open up a software or even a data engineering role, and within a day, 800 to 1,000 applications, with 90 to 99% of them being completely fake, right? And
Yeah.
yeah, so it's really helpful. Jason, from your vantage point, like where are companies most underestimating the risk in that front of funnel?
Yeah, I just want to also answer, well,
Yeah,
add on to what Kari said, in addition to what you asked Kari about, is it
please.
happening elsewhere? We see it coming in a lot on customer support roles. We actually have a lot of healthcare
Hmm.
tech companies and fintech companies that reach out to us because their customer support jobs have become a pretty vulnerable pipeline. They're typically like higher churn, faster hiring cycles, and remote, and they touch customer information, and they're just easier to get jobs. So than your traditional software engineering role. So I'd say that's definitely something to also look out for.
Yeah,
Um,
so maybe it started in some of these remote roles and these technical roles because they might have a little bit more technical prowess to use the tools that they are, but these tools are evolving and it's getting smarter and easier to use that candidates in other areas are going to start taking advantage to. Very
yeah,
helpful. But yeah,
and
what
then
go
yeah,
ahead.
sorry. So and then I was just gonna answer your question on the underestimating risk. So like
Yeah.
definitely at I mean, top of funnel for sure. I think I still do talk to companies where they have remote technical jobs and they don't believe it's a problem. And typically, when I speak to a company like that, my tentacles go up in that they probably don't have a full grasp on the like severity of the situation because those two attributes, remote and technical jobs, like that's what we look for when we prospect with customers. We look to see, are you remote? Do you have technical roles or do you have customer support roles? And if a company that we talk to says like, oh yeah, it's not really a problem, or we have it under grasp, we do XYZ, it's clear that either the emphasis hasn't been made strongly enough on how big of a problem this is, or you know, maybe the team just feels they have a better grip on things than they might. We actually see a lot of those companies end up coming back because something like another one bites the dust, and then they have an issue. But where I'm seeing people more exposed now is like on video calls. Um, Common themes that because you actually mentioned Matt, like maybe companies aren't allowed to talk about, hey, what did Jason look like and sound like when you interviewed him? Like, I don't think that's a conversation very many people have,
Yeah.
or maybe they do. I could be, talking to the wrong people, but um, in very large organizations where you're having hundreds of interviews happen a week, or maybe even like thousands of interviews happen a week, the likelihood that 10 interviewers or 5 interviewers are talking to each other about the characteristics of the person to corroborate identity is quite low. And you actually have a lot of interview swapping, interview proxies, like stepping in for one another. And it's something that a lot of companies don't even realize. The deepfake stuff is getting way better. Like, we all, again, I showed you that example the other week, but I think if you're remote and you're like enterprise and you have a couple thousand employees or even over 1,000 employees, like is likely a good amount of interview switching or proxy interviewing happening where you might want to take a closer look.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about the fact that there is a lack of sort of communication and within even the hiring teams, because earlier I was talking about even between companies where there are in the same field, more of that collaboration between different companies, and it's kind of taboo, right? Like recruiting leaders aren't out here and recruiters aren't out there just talking about their company getting hacked, right? Like they can't, right? And so it's hard for folks to know if they're not a part of discussions like this. So I really appreciate that y'all are here and doing that. Because Maria actually has a question here, and this is one that I've been getting a lot. Like when we get to the this the subject of candidate fraud and AI use, inevitably someone goes, what's the best approach to safeguard, as far as do we just allow candidates, not allow candidates to use AI, and adjust the process to assess their level without it, or allow them, but ensure that we're trained internally, to handle that, right? And something that I've kind of the consensus I'm seeing from the community, and I would love to hear how y'all are tackling that question too, but is that most teams are moving away from sort of a complete no AI stance, and the reason is because most of these companies are now, that's part of the job. They're saying we want you to utilize AI in the job, and so if you don't assess for how they use AI,
Mm-hmm.
and walk them through the strategy of how they're using it, and the why behind it, then that's probably a problem, right? Later on, because you're not truly assessing the skill, and so we've seen sort of either a dual track AI, no AI amongst community members, and then we've had one where it's, we have a very clear AI policy that we've established every applicant sees, and so they know how we're using AI, and then we give them a little rules of the road of like how we expect them to use AI in the process, right? Which just sets those boundaries, right, to operate in. But maybe Kari or Nick, how did y'all kind of decide this as far as AI in the interview, AI not in the interview, to eliminate risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a work in progress for a lot of companies.
Yeah,
I don't know if everybody is fully, to their like post AI interviewing vision and what that process should look like.
totally.
And a lot of that is the fact that you have to rebuild your entire evaluatory framework for not just what we're assessing for, but how we're assessing, and making sure that you are arming interviewers and hiring managers to be, comfortable and competent assessors of talent who's working in concert with AI. And so that's a bigger lift. I could change the policy tomorrow and say AI is okay across all the interview processes or across all roles, and bring AI utilization into the light of day where we can, see very transparently where the candidate ends and the AI begins and how they complement one another. However, that policy change is the easy part. The hard part is operationalizing all that other stuff. And I think that's what as I've talked with peers, that's what they're all in the throes of, is working the stuff they need to, get sorted as prerequisites to release that policy. And so it will be, probably the next 12 months of figuring out how to operationalize that at scale. Smaller companies are going to be able to move more quickly than that. But I would say we're on that journey with you. We haven't fully found ourselves at the post AI transparency version of hiring yet.
Totally, and our data from the state is validating that, right? It's a majority of functions don't yet have an established AI policy, all right, and so we're definitely in that stage of maturity where we're moving from from AI and the risk associated to being really productivity based, into getting it to where AI is more infrastructure and a protection layer, as well for both candidates and the companies, right? So thank you for calling that out. I don't want people listening here to think that, oh, wait, I don't have an AI policy yet. I don't have this all figured out. I'm really behind. No, you're not. That's why we're having these conversations, right? But speaking of speed, and I think TA is always under pressure to move fast, right? Like, how do you introduce verification without adding additional friction to to the process that slows hiring down a bit? Jason, what about you? When you talk about that automated fraud layer, what does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of some of the solutions that are available, including ours, will do things that recruiters might already be familiar with, right? Like looking for someone's digital footprint and things like that. It takes a considerable amount of time to do that for one person, so we automate a function of that. But for us, like what an automated fraud layer looks like exists across a number of categories that we evaluate to look for signs of suspicion and basically confirm whether this could actually be the real person. So we look at a candidate's digital footprint, their contact information, socials. We look at the documents they're submitting as well. And then we've actually built our own proprietary signals off of all of this. Also, because we were pretty early to doing this, we've collected a ton of data over time. Like we started doing this in at the beginning of 2023. Um, because we actually had an AI resume screening tool, and when we gave it to people, they came back and said, "Hey, I think I'm talking to people that aren't who they said they were," and so we started investigating it more and more. So we've actually been on this for like a pretty long period of time, um, but that automation layer is doing things that also recruiters don't have the ability to access or that they can't do themselves. And a lot of I saw a lot of comments here. People were dropping in things like Ashby and and other tools, and there are definitely some interesting things out there. One of the differences in the way we approach things is not only do we look for signs of risk and suspicion, which is what the majority of all these other tools do, but we've built stuff to actually help confirm whether the person applying is the person that they say they are, which is a little bit of a different take and approach on the entire market. And that's how we were able to help validate some of the assumptions that like Kari brought to us, and it's what we're doing with Nick and his team. And so that's how we look at it. And worked with a ton of um, we've worked with a ton of customers to make sure it's like fully embedded in the workflow, because we don't want you to have to leave the existing tools that you're using. We want you to be able to stay right there. And so this has been like, we built it through like a labor of love, and um, through feedback of, what recruiters are seeing daily, but also what we know to be important.
Awesome. And I get Nick. Hey, I think what we're really talking about here is speed and integrity, right? And so how do you decide where to place integrity checks so that they strengthen the process instead of bogging it down?
I think our approach has been to never verify before you value. So if you put like a heavy verification at the very start, at the apply button or before the apply button, you're going to lose 10 out of 10 excellent passive candidates who have zero patience for application friction. So
Yeah.
you need to place those integrity gates like immediately following the first moment of mutual interest is what we found to work the best. A candidate hits application submit in your ATS or on your job board ports to your ATS. And while in that application review stage, your identity verification fraud detection solution does its thing. Tofu or another point solution, providing an insight set of signals that the recruiter can use to make the call with more information in hand. And that has always been our goal. Is like recruiter makes a decision at the end of the day. And intelligence should provide them more data that is really difficult for them to like harvest, cultivate at scale quickly on their own. So we're automating what is a very cumbersome and thorough set of checks and signal collection that Tofu does on our behalf. And so this ensures we aren't wasting a hiring manager's most expensive asset, their time, on candidates who haven't been verified, while still keeping the initial application process not friction free, but friction light, so that legitimate talent isn't disincentivized to go ahead and finish the application process.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. It's technological, but it's also human checks, and so it's recruiters being aware of this, being exposed to this, understanding what if something feels off, like dig a little deeper into that. Maybe Kari, Aaron Ferguson has a question very related to this, and it says, what's the best advice for recruiters to spot this live themselves? Like say someone got through the filter, they're in a call, and so like outside of just the automation and tooling, like what are the human checks that recruiters should be doing or looking out for?
I think that's changing a lot, right?
Yeah,
That's kind of where I tried to build some enablement, and then Jason showed us an example last week that would have not caught it. And if that becomes the new normal, then we are, completely continuously needing to pivot. But I think there's this element of discernment. So whether it's just to know that it exists, I think, and to always have the additional questions kind of in the back pocket to just feel like the verification of this is a human. People have done the hand wave thing, and maybe that's like so 3 months ago at this point.
Hmm.
Right? The extra check on the resume. I saw in the Slack a lot of people have integrated these guardrails. My thought is that a lot of this is not scalable. And so while we can't automate for ensuring that, and transparently, we don't want to create a whole nother list of AI fraudulent detection and can't questions in a
yeah, you
recruiting
want like
screen.
more gotcha questions like we used to have back in the day, which was just silly. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. So there's this idea of discernment, and I'm not sure that I would point to just one that's it, but I think it's just continuing to understand the evolution,
Yeah.
staying close, looking, trading notes with your peers, and understanding how people are getting through.
yeah.
But ultimately, I totally agree with Jason in this, like, how can we create this automated fraud layer? And if it's not in like looking at IP addresses and back-end resume, AI detection reviews, it could be getting creative with your AI, transcription and video interviewer. It's looking at like reports that just basically create watch points. And then I think Nick mentioned this earlier is once you start to see patterns, there's no sure thing, but if it's like 4 out of the 5 watch points were detected, then you start to gain a little bit more confidence and understanding what your next steps and escalation points could be.
That's super helpful. It's sort of like, if you're in the interview, you start noticing, it's that discernment thing you talked about, right? You notice that there's pauses before they answer, right? Or like their answers maybe a little too kind of a blanket. It's not sort of coming from personal experience to dive a little bit deeper. Like, how did that actually, like asking some smart follow-up questions to really get to the heart of it. That is super helpful. Let's talk through maybe some ownership and accountability. So as organizations grow, that integrity can't just rely on just some of that instinct we talked about. Kari, in your experience, where should responsibility for candidate truth sit? Is this squarely a TA issue, or does it need partnership with security and risk teams?
Yeah. I think it's a partnership. I was trying to think about this, and it wasn't too long ago, and I was like, it kind of reminds me of like all the phishing campaigns that
Mm,
IT did, right? It was like excuse me, we did a little bit of the gotchas there with internal employees, but it really helped people with that discernment and understanding like, how does this look? Let me do that extra check in the email, or does this seem odd that I'm getting an email from the CEO or the founder? And so I do think there's this element of um partnership and like not trying to recreate the wheel and working with your IT teams to see kind of what's worked for them and get creative in that collaboration, knowing that TA and recruiting will be, the face of it just because of how it's entering our funnel.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, right? Because I think you hit on something here that this is happening on all sides of the equation. Like candidates are getting fraud, job outreaches too from recruiters, and so it's like using that discernment of like, oh, if this is coming from, a Gmail, well, would a recruiter that worked in house at a company be, hitting me up from a personal Gmail account? Probably not, right? But but sometimes you're not thinking, right? And so it's being diligent, and it's the same training that our IT team gives to us about phishing scams. You're absolutely correct, right? And so we have to think about that as recruiters and as job candidates. Really important to talk about. So Nick, where do you align hiring managers around some of these risks? Like, what's their part in this?
Yeah, I mean, hiring managers may view integrity checks or fraud checks as like TA red tape initially, until they've lived through like a ghost hire scenario where someone interviews brilliantly, perhaps with some sort of assistance, and shows up day one unable to perform their basic tasks. And so we align them by framing it as time protection, which I think is a pretty standard approach for change management for hiring teams like this. I tell managers, as a team, it's our job to ensure that every 30, 45, 60 minutes you spend in an interview is spent with real qualified humans. And if we don't run these checks, I'm essentially asking you to play an additional role, unpaid, as a fraud investigator, in addition to attempting to
Yeah.
hire. And so when they see it as a shield for their calendar rather than a hurdle for their headcount, the alignment tends to happen relatively easily.
Interesting. Jason, what about you? Like, what from your perspective, what are some frameworks that you're seeing, some frameworks, I should say, that you're seeing that more mature companies adopt? Like, are there, are there things that leaders should be putting in place before even deciding on a tech solution for this?
Yeah, so like in terms of I think there's the framework to figure out if you have this issue. Um, and then there's the framework to actually go and figure out like how to put solutions towards it. Like I don't necessarily think that there is a framework that you can use that will help you stop this if it isn't something automated. And it's not because I started a fraud detection company. It's because I actually do believe it's like nearly impossible to do this in the same way that like recruiters are looking for AI to help them screen resumes. Like I would actually argue you could screen resumes, for job fit faster than you can validate whether someone is who they say they are. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the webinar chat about people using LinkedIn's real LinkedIn's and pretending to be them when they're
Yes,
not.
that happened
We
to me.
actually, yeah, we just put out a blog on Monday about impersonations, and so Tofu, and keep in mind, Tofu, not yet doesn't have every single company in the world using our platform. But we flagged 67,000 impersonation cases or cases where there are the attributes to confidently say that these are likely people impersonating others. That's 67,000 when we're connected to we have just over 100 customers. So 67,000 and just like with that number.
That's just the first 2 months of the year.
In the first 2 months of the year, yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can get by with a framework that is manual and like analog. The framework I see is you have A, B, C, D, E point in the funnel, whether it be like pre-interview, so like application review, conversation, so interviews taking place, and background check. There's a tool to solve it. There's an associated workflow and an SOP for what to do when you're faced with certain outcomes from what that tool like offers. There is the portion of that SOP that tells you how to interface with security, and ideally you have a tool that is well integrated with both TA and security, so you actually don't have to be burdening one another team's time with sharing information back to the other team,
Mhm.
because that can take a lot of effort. So you actually want something that's mindful of that. And then, um, you know, that I think is how teams should be approaching.
Yeah.
It.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah, the folks talking in the chat like, yeah, we're feeling more like private investigator than matchmaker to open positions, right? Like you don't want that. Like you do want to be able to kind of fight fire with fire, use technology, solutions to fight technology problems, and so the recruiters can we're not wasting time. Hiring managers, recruiters, in the process. It's very very helpful. Kari, how about you? Like, how should TA leaders maybe work with the executive team or get their buy-in? Like, what's the most compelling way to show that protecting the funnel improves outcomes, not just compliance?
Yeah, I think there's that like those big scary examples. I think you used the word like national threat earlier, right? And so depending
Yeah.
on the industry and what the infiltration looks like, there is the risk is huge. I think if we think outside of that, or just knowing that that does exist, we can think about time lost, right? And if you have aggressive goals as a business and you have talent dense teams, right? You have people very committed to do very specific projects. And this is a lot of noise that could take away and distract from that. Not only is it like getting people through and then realizing that they're fraudulent or not who they say they are. It's also like the training and incorporated to create that discernment. And so you want to find that balance of like, do we want to be handling these dedicated fraudulent detection trainings across the company in addition to everything else we have to do? And so in my mind, success would look like being able to feel like we're being proactive in the frameworks that we've put in place, the investments that we've made are supporting this automated fraud layer detection. The reports that we're looking at are catching the right things to give us enough signal to not have to bother the business with it. And so
Mhm.
it's more about that time saved and time to allow the business to focus on the things and the initiatives that they set out to focus on.
Lovely. And so, Kari, actually, Justin's got a question specifically for you. He asked, what job description tweaks have you made that have been helpful to mitigate fraudulent candidates?
I was actually at a conference maybe 6 months ago, and somebody mentioned it, and it felt like something we can't measure, unfortunately, but one of those things like it couldn't hurt, especially in the remote first. And some actually companies have introduced more onboarding, on-site onboarding or opportunities to be in person. And it was really just adding this actually worked for one of the partnerships that I was in, was adding a layer of saying, there is a possibility or potential for on-site interviewing. And
Yeah.
so making sure that
Uh-huh.
the applicant would be receptive to that. And it's an easy deterrent. And it's up to the business to decide if they want to invite the candidate on site, if that allows and kind of works with their framework of interviewing. Another one was introducing on-site onboarding. And so onboarding and just being transparent that we would require people to fly to a certain location, to an office. And it actually, with this particular partner, I think it was their very first live onboarding experience, and two of the like 20 people actually opted out. We ran them through Tofu, and one of them was a for sure fraudulent candidate that had gotten all the way through the process. And so I do think it's like, don't sleep on these live opportunities and in-person opportunities. I know we're in a remote first world for many companies, but it is a nice layer if um, you can integrate it within your current practices to, not only detect fraud, but also create that experience that everybody's kind of looking for, those touch points.
I love that transparency and authenticity for the win because it's saying the more transparent we are about our process and we
Mhm.
really explain, we might deter because it sounds like the scammers for this type of stuff are looking for vulnerabilities, looking for companies that aren't communicating that effectively, and so if you do, it can be a good deterrent. It's awesome. That's a really good answer. Um, let's talk a little bit about measuring the impact of it, like the business case of fighting fraud. And I love that in the chat they're talking about how they should add security expert to the job description for recruiters, right? I think that's interesting, right? Like, who would have thought we would be the new line of defense for national security and in company security, but yet here we are, but yeah, like what's what's the business case beyond mitigating risk, right? Jason, right? Across your customer base, where does the financial impact of fraud show up most clearly?
Yeah, I think like, it's first in like time.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of people also tell you like saving time is not the best value prop. Um, but in this case, there is just if a company gets 500,000 applications a year and 30% of those applications are engineers and X% are remote. And then it's taking you 2 to 3 minutes to validate like every single person that you want to talk to. Like those numbers add up to a considerable amount. And I don't know, it's one day and you haven't even managed to get through like a full pipeline of people because you're having to play detective. So it's top of funnel, time suck for sure. Um, then there's the cannibalization of like time slots and phone calls for legitimate people. So, going back to what Nick said about communicating, like the eating up the interviewer's time. That's like the second thing. And also the opportunity cost of that slot having not gone to someone that's legitimate. So that's the second. Um, but like in terms of severity, like I think that's, the second layer issue. I think the first is really like fraud detection is kind of like an insurance policy because I don't think anyone wants to be the one to let someone through. And then once you have someone inside, I mean, there are teams entirely devoted to internal threats, like insider threat. At large companies like Anthropic, OpenAI, these companies have massive insider threat teams because you let someone in and they're, wreaking havoc on the company from all different
And these are government
possible.
contractors, a lot of these
Right.
companies,
And if,
right? Yeah.
yeah, for sure. We actually have some customers that are FedRAMP and they take this like so seriously because God forbid they let someone in and then, that person gets to interface with like some government uh, information, then they're kind of screwed. And so you have the whole, okay, like we're losing time at application review and then we're cannibalizing like interview time to like these bad actors. But then the irreversible, like, Jeff Bezos talks about like there's like first first types first like types of problems and second types of problems, ones that are reversible and non-reversible. The non-reversible ones are you let this person through, there's a Trojan horse or a ransom attack on the company, and now there's like a $15 million problem that you have to solve because I don't know, your
It's
code base is
expensive.
being like held ransom or whatever. Like there's actually been cases like this
Staring
that you
at
can read
Jason.
that you can read on. No, but I'm serious, you can read
Yeah.
online. And I think that's what insurance sells. That's kind of what security sells.
It's mitigating
Um,
risk, like risk of
yeah,
financial ruin. Like we saw a lot of these small businesses getting attacked and hit this way in 2020, right? When everyone went remote, there was a lot of businesses getting ransomware attacks and things like that, right? And so that can happen, regardless. That is amazing. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. I'm gonna do one last rapid fire for everyone, and then if we have a little time, grab some more of the questions. So I think we've been doing a great job of kind of tackling them as they come in. But yeah, so closing questions for Kari and Nick. For TA leaders watching, if you could give them one piece of advice, and Jason, you too, if you got that you've learned from your client base, one piece of advice to prioritize in the next 90 days to strengthen that hiring integrity, what would it be? And I think what prompted this too is several folks in chat asking like what are some tactical suggestions? What's your advice, Kari?
Yeah, we've touched on it a little bit, but I think in my mind, I don't think we can do this without automation. And I empathize with Dave when he said, I feel like I'm a private investigator and not a recruiter. And that's exactly what, like, my goal is to offset and mitigate so that the recruiters don't have to feel the pain of it as much as they had before. And so, whether that's making an investment in tools, top of funnel, figuring out where to plant little guardrails in each stage of the process. And I think the idea of patterns is going to be a big one. There's no one gotcha moment here, but it's ways to use your AI video interview or reporting software to create a report that detects, on interviews and reviewing that regularly, looking at a resume check, working with the recruiter and adding one question to a scorecard about the likelihood and putting those three things together, right? So it's just ways to continue to get ahead of the problem before ultimately at offer. So you always are able to be a little bit more proactive about your approach without using a heavy lift and just relying on the recruiter to absorb this unrealistic responsibility to catch everyone.
Got it. And Rachel was asking, like, when you say automation at the beginning of your answer there, like, what do you mean specifically? Like a tofu that you put that can automatically, that way you just kind of have, you have that security of knowing, okay, if I'm talking to somebody, and tofu through their 30 points didn't flag it, then I feel confident, or what? So yeah,
Yeah, that's one example,
automation.
top of funnel. That's a great example. I think tofu is great for that reason because it can weed out a ton of candidates. The other example was we actually used MetaView with one of the partnerships. They were working with MetaView and they were able to build a report that somebody looks at regularly. And that report does all the things that I think people had touched on here. And it just basically flags when there is, sudden shifts in tone, transcription pacing cues, answers that are significantly more formal or verbose, right? It's looking at all of these signals and it's able to kind of flag there on the back end, not needing the recruiter to do anything that's owned by RecOps. And we're able to detect, is there a signal for potential fraudulent activity within these interviews?
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Rapid fire advice. What do you got? Oh, you're muted.
Yep,
There you
always needed. Start somewhere. I mean, if you haven't done anything because you're not sure how to start, like scrutinizing your hiring process is a great place to begin. Doing an analysis of your past candidates through tools like Tofu and others, just to like have data to back up how significant is this problem for us and where are our hotspots is
go.
also an excellent place to start. And then
Yeah,
you
some
can
people
deploy a solution maybe a little bit more surgically, only for certain roles or only certain areas of the business, but you're starting somewhere. And then
yeah,
as you have access to these tools and better data, it will inform and illuminate other hotspots or other potential gaps in your defense line, and then you move on to that thing. And so it will be an evolving strategy. I can't give you an exact blueprint to follow because your tech stack is different, your hiring process may look a little bit different, your candidates may look a little bit different than mine, but you do need to start somewhere. And I would say start with scrutinizing your ATS, your historical candidate data, bring data to the conversation. And then when you do deploy a solution, be transparent about it. If someone's being recorded, proctored, verified, tell them exactly why, how the data is stored, when it's going to be deleted. Make requests to retrieve and delete that data pretty straightforward. Legitimate candidates actually find this reassuring. It signals that the company they're joining has high standards and protects
yeah.
its.
No, I think that is great advice, right? So like audit. I mean, some might not even know yet that this is actually something that's affecting them, right?
Yeah,
So awesome, Jason. Close us off. What from a product standpoint, what's next for Tofu? What features and capabilities are customers asking for next?
totally. I just want to also, before I do that, quickly tack on to like what Kari and Nick said in terms of like, one piece of advice. I would say don't assume all fraud detection is the same. Um, like that's the biggest thing I think, at least for me, like I think someone should take away from this is there's a lot of ATSs that are, adding things in. But there's a reason why there's fraud detection companies for every single industry. It's because they're not all the same. And I
Yeah,
think traditionally a lot of folks at companies will hear, oh, this ATS puts out this fraud detection feature, or this one puts out this fraud detection feature. They're all being outsourced to some company. And if it's not a company that is specifically focused on like recruiting fraud detection, then you could be playing with fire. Like IP address can be easily circumvented. All of these things can be easily circumvented. So if it's not something focused on that particular use case, I think you do need to be mindful.
That's such important advice, right? Because I think a lot of recruiters I'm talking to, and their teams are using LLMs, to do certain things related to hiring, or even assessing talent fit and stuff like that. Candidates using LLMs to to attach them to and see if they fit for a role, but that these LLMs are not trained. They're not. There's no cross validation process done, and to build these algorithms for this specific use case, and how that's really important. That you're using an algorithm, you're using a tool that was right fit for that situation and trained on data in similar situations. That's a
Yeah, and I
great,
think
great
that's why
point.
we exist.
Yeah.
And then in terms of what's next for us, like we're moving down funnel. So we're not just staying at the top. Like, we're evolving from a point solution to a platform. That's been our mission from the start, and that's where we're going to continue to go. So we'll be launching some other stuff like over the next, few weeks. And that will hopefully be helpful to other teams.
Awesome. That's great. And we still had so many questions left over. Thank you all for going a few minutes over. Thank you so much, Kari, Nick, and Jason, for your valuable insights. And thank everybody. We'll see if we can follow up after the webinar on some of these hanging questions. I'll share them with our panel. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Matt. Thanks,
Of
Kari.
course.
Thanks, Nick. Good to see y'all.